Welcome to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen here with life coach Cindy Chavez. Today is Wednesday, August the 28th. Happy Neville Day, everybody. It is 4 p.m. in New York. That's 1 p.m. Los Angeles time, 9 p.m. in London. That would make 5 a.m. in Tokyo and 6 a.m. in Sydney, Australia. But wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us for another episode of LOA Today, your daily dose of happy. And I'm happy to be back here at home doing the podcast with Cindy after our extensive trip to Virginia, which was ostensibly for a sad purpose, but Cindy actually turned out to be a pretty happy trip.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, we said goodbye to my mom, but on the other hand, I reconnected with a couple of cousins I haven't seen or talked with in over 40 years, which was just absolutely awesome. Got to see my sister and my brother and my niece, and it was just good. It was a very, very good weekend. I mean, dealing with the memorial service parties and all the fun in the world, but we also took her ashes to the lake where she and my dad retired to, Smith Mountain Lake, and scattered ashes there, right where we'd also scattered ashes for my dad. So they're reunited in that sense. And then we ran a boat and we spent the rest of the day boating on the lake. So how bad could that be, right?
Really? Wonderful. Yeah. And you had wonderful weather, it sounds like, because you don't usually rent a boat if the weather's terrible. So,
well, in this case, you had to rent the boat regardless of the weather and hope that it was going to work good. But, Louise and I also have our experience with influencing weather. So we weren't terribly concerned. And interestingly enough, on that score, my sister had reported to me a few days before we drove down there that the weather forecast for that weekend was rain. And I said, yeah, well, this is easy. No problem at all. And Louise and I started working on it. And PJ, who's also into LOA, started working on it too. And by the time Saturday and Sunday rolled around, it was just gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous weather.
Wonderful. That's so cool. Yeah, I love it. I love that you had such a good trip. And I know that you all seem to have a lot of peace about your mother's passing. And so there wasn't a lot of grieving, sadness kind of grief. I know you have grief, but,
Actually none. And that's the part that's been the most astonishing and stunning about this whole experience.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had to pin me down and ask me what my dominant emotion was, it's joy for my mom.
That's fantastic.
Because she didn't want to be here. I mean, I am 100% sure of that. The last year of her life, she was done.
Yeah.
And she was ready to move on, and she wanted to reconnect with my dad, I'm sure. And she did. And that's a happy thing.
It's really interesting when we think about that. I know Abraham talks about that a lot.
Yeah.
About, and I've told that story about when I used to work for the doctors that told me that when we couldn't figure out why this woman wasn't recovering, and the doctor said to me, well, she didn't want to be here under our care. Her daughters made her come, and she doesn't really have any will to live. She's finished. And that once someone gives up their will to live, there's not a whole lot you can do to keep them here. They're ready to go. And so, when you told me that, I thought, okay. And it's just wonderful that you all got to go and remember her and have a memorial and reconnect together and spend a beautiful day. And it couldn't really go any better than that, could it?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it was very, very good. And the weather was more cooperative than in our last podcast that you and I did together.
Right? Oh my goodness. So you could see the walls of my office now. Last Wednesday at the end of the podcast, as I was, seeing the little square where I could see myself, all of a sudden it was just like I was in a black cave. It was just pitch black. And I remember saying, oh, it's like as dark as night here. And then all of a sudden, poof, I was gone.
About 30 seconds later, you were gone. I remember Jeffrey posting something like, well, there goes Cindy.
Yeah, you sent me a message. You said, Jeffrey said, I think the storm got Cindy or something. I was like, yes, it was a really bad thunderstorm. And we lost power for just a second. It wasn't long enough for me to realize like everything flashed, but the computer flashed, and that
computer didn't like it. Yeah.
Right. And then it started to come back on, and it gave me that message that said, this may take a while updating. Right. I thought, okay, it was 5 minutes before the show. I'm like, okay, I think my work is done here.
Absolutely.
well, fingers crossed that we can stay connected here on the show for the entire hour today. And
we've often talked about getting signs from the universe, from our inner being and so forth. That was a sign you couldn't miss. That was a so obvious sign. sign.
You're done. Yes.
So anyway, before we get started with the book, let's make sure that we do our promotional announcements. First and foremost, if you're not yet a subscriber to the podcast, please become one. Very simple to do. You can find us on all of the major and most of the minor podcast platforms, including iTunes and Google Play and Pandora and Spotify and just about everything you can imagine out there. Plus, also, we're now on YouTube. And we live stream to YouTube, so you can watch us there. And by the way, Cindy, we've kind of been moving more into the 21st century here in the Thiessen household, in that we're now doing stuff with Amazon Prime and watching stuff and so forth. And for the first time, I actually watched our video podcast through the television set, and it finally dawned on me: people can actually do that.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, well, geez, we got to spruce up the show here. We got to put up some new decorations or whatever, because they can actually see us and they can watch us on their televisions.
It's so funny. Like we know they've been watching us all along, but there was a little shift there in you when you realized.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think it's time for a new background. But anyway, if you're not yet a subscriber, again, you can find us on all the platforms, but the simplest way to do it is just to go to loatoday.net, and right at the top of the page, you will find instructions for how to subscribe with your particular device. And for subscribing on YouTube, of course, just go to YouTube and do a search for LOA Today podcast videos, which I know is a lot to type in on an Amazon Prime account, but nevertheless, you can actually do it. You can actually probably speak it faster than you can type it, but do the search and we'll pop up, and then click the subscribe and the little bell to get notified, so that every time that we come on live, you can join us in the live stream, just like Jeffrey and others do. And Jeffrey says, yes, we are watching you. Thank you for that assurance there, Jeffrey. I'm not sure how I'm going to take it, but no, but seriously, thank you very much for all of our listeners, especially our podcast listeners, but also for our YouTube listeners who are increasing in numbers, because we really love doing these shows for you, especially on Neville Day. And it's Neville Day again.
Neville Day.
How exciting is that? Yeah. And we're talking about his magnum opus, his last book, his most complete book, I would argue. I think we probably both agree on that.
I would think so.
Yeah. And it's been interesting for the first 3 chapters. I mean, it's been another Neville adventure, because we've been spending a lot of time on each chapter. Some of the chapters have gone for multiple episodes. And that's always a sign that there's so much meat there that we want to make sure we chew it all up before we swallow it.
It's so funny too, how many times we've had sort of just synchronicity in the podcast itself, where someone will be talking about something and then we'll cover it right after the book or whatever. And when I was excited when I saw the last chapter title that we did, which was Turn the Wheel Backward, because we had been discussing the idea of revising our memories of things.
Right.
And then during those discussions that we had the last 2 weeks, we talked about the idea that of scripting something or revising something, and the idea of, like, is that telling a lie? Right. And we talked about how sometimes people are a little averse to affirmations because they feel like they're lying to themselves, and what is a lie and what is the truth and all of that. And I see the chapter title for today, and it's There Is No Fiction. Yes, but I'm okay. We're right on track, because this is what we had been discussing before. And so I think that's kind of funny how it all always weaves together in such a perfect way.
Just to further nail the point home, right? That this stuff is just as when you think you've got it figured out and you're kind of got a handle on, this, I don't know if I can stretch that far. Then Neville says, okay, now stretch it farther.
Oh, right. That reminds me of that time, I had gone through something really difficult, and I had been resisting a certain situation for a long time. And it wasn't changing, so it really wasn't useful to resist. But I just had so much resistance about it. I was struggling against it so much. And then I finally, one day, I got real clarity about it. And I remember saying, you know what? I accept this. I totally accept it. And I felt like such a rock star, right? Like, for some reason, I felt really, really clear about it. And I felt so much better. I had released all this resistance. And I just said, I totally accept this. And my higher, wiser self said, well, can you love it? I was like, really? Seriously? Like, I thought I had arrived. And then it's like my higher self appeared to just kick my ass, right? It's like, now I have to love this? I just said I would accept it. That's Neville. Push us a little bit further.
That's right. Push us further. Actually, I was thinking about that on my walk today. I was thinking about how each time that we, as individuals, push ourselves a little bit, kind of expand the envelope beyond the comfort zone and do that a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. Over time, we get to the point where that becomes a fairly comfortable activity. It becomes so familiar that we're okay with doing it. And what I'm really discovering more consciously is that it also enables me, I'm going to speak for myself, it enables me to apply what I know more frequently and consistently throughout my day. Because actually what I'm learning is this thing that we need to learn about applying it more regularly is actually about overcoming a level of resistance, or I should say levels of resistance.
Right.
And the more that we just keep expanding that envelope, we do exactly that. It's almost like we do it by erosion. We don't come at it with like an atomic bomb. We just kind of melt it away over time.
Well, that's a good point, because when a lot of times we think of resistance as, when these things occur that we are very resistant to, like obviously, like in ourselves saying, no, I don't want that to happen. But it's usually not like that. It's usually that it's that primal part of our brain that resists any kind of change. And so when we try to push a little bit further, or to do something, like you said, a little bit out of our comfort zone, which, most of the things we say we want and we don't have yet are outside of our comfort zone. So,
oh yes.
And so when we try to do that, there's that part of us that does not want change, and it's resistant to change, even if the change is really benign. Because we like to be comfortable. We like things that we know that we're safe with. And so we stay on that same path, or maybe a treadmill.
A little bit of each. Yeah, a little bit of each, I think.
Yeah.
So let's expand the envelope and discover whether or not there really is no such thing as fiction.
Let's see. Neville says there is no fiction. He starts with a quote from John S. Mackenzie. He says, the distinction between what is real and what is imaginary is not one that can be fully maintained. All existing things are, in an intelligible sense, imaginary. My guess about that is this idea that we all recognize that everything is happening in our mind, right? It's all mental. So that's the sense in that even things that are existing are imaginary. It's because we are perceiving them through our mind, through our brain. Okay, so Neville says there is no fiction. If an imaginal activity can produce a physical effect, our physical world must be essentially imaginal. To prove this would require merely that we observe our imaginal activities and watch to see whether or not they produce corresponding external effects. If they do, then we must conclude there is no fiction. Today's imaginal drama, fiction, becomes tomorrow's fact. If we had this wider view of causation, that causation is mental, not physical, that our mental states are causative of physical effects, then we would realize our responsibility as a creator and imagine only the best imaginable.
I always believed that, but now I'm not so sure that we do. We spend so much time not doing that. Can
I tell you that yesterday morning, my husband woke up with a sore throat. He said, I have a sore throat. And I said, oh, goodness, so started brainstorming on what you do for a sore throat. And by last night, he had the head cold from hell, really awful.
Wow.
And of course, I started feeling that feeling you feel when something is trying to come on, right? And this idea right here of imagining the best possible, you know how many times I had to pivot? Because I'm fine now. I'm fine right now. But last night, I felt I was going down that path pretty heavily. And so I started saying, stop. Like every time my mind would say, I had all those thoughts, right? I had a recording that I had to make. this morning,
Mm-hmm.
and I had the podcast this afternoon,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a call in between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And my brain kept saying last night, oh no, if you get a sore throat, you won't be able to finish the recording. If you get a sore throat, how are you going to do your call in the podcast? And what if you get really sick and you could be, and I kept every time having to pivot back and say, that's not what I want. And that's not what I'm going to think about. But this idea right here, if we had this wider view of causation, then we'd realize that we had responsibility as a creator. And that's what I kept realizing. But my mind was not automatically imagining the best imaginable. It was not. It kept trying to take me down the path of what if.
And Jeffrey was just yanking our chain by saying it's been going around, which of course is exactly what we tend to say when these things happen, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, even now I say to myself, well, it still could happen, right? I could finish the podcast today and tomorrow morning wake up, right? And my brain is still trying to convince me with logic
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how likely it is that I
Yes.
might end up sick. So, okay.
I was noticing that logic thing too, particularly in the last day or so about medical stuff and health. I've really come to believe that all of our health situations, both adverse and healthy health, are directly related to what we think about, to what we focus our attention on. And yet I live in a society where I included am involved in, well, did I take my vitamins today? Has my wife taken her meds? What did the doctor say about this?
Right.
My sister called me and told me about how doctors had said that the G5 or 5G rather, the 5G technology for cell phones, the next generation cell phones, is actually damaging to your health. I mean, it's like endless streams of stuff about, all these external things that control our health. When I know deep down, I'm the one doing it. And yet I buy into all this other stuff. It's amazing.
Well, remember, we have to be a little easy on ourselves by remembering a couple of things. And that is that energy entrains to itself.
Yeah.
And we live in a world where there are billions of other people. And so all of their vibrations affect our vibration.
That's true. And by the way, Jeffrey posted something really good here. He says, it's also okay to get sick every once in a while. Sometimes we need a reminder to take it easy and take care of ourselves.
That's so true. It's so true. And, whenever you hear somebody it's usually somebody that works really, really a lot of hours, really hard. And then they say, I finally got a day off and I got sick.
Yeah, right.
And I'm always like, well, that's your body saying, I used to work for a naturopathic physician. And one time I got this bad cold and I was feeling really down on myself because of it. I realized that mentally it was like there was something wrong with me. I was really beating myself up.
Mm-hmm.
And she asked me, what's going on? Because of course I was there at work and I said, I just feel so bad. Like I'm trying to take good care of myself. Like I do all these things right. And then I still end up with this bad cold. And she said to me, it's not that you get sick that's a problem. It's how your body responds to the sickness once you get it. And she said a cold in the body is that your body collects viruses, and a cold is your body's the way of getting rid of them. You shed the virus when you sneeze, when you cough, all these things. And she said it's like a forest fire cleaning out a forest. It's nature's way of keeping you healthy. She said, so, if you get one cold a year and she said it's actually a healthy thing. And so it kind of changed my perspective on that, right? She said, it's when you get a cold every other week and you just can't get well from it. Then you know that you've got to, boost your immune system or your health or whatever. But so I always think about that, and like Jeffrey said, sometimes that's the only way our body can get us to slow down, be still, be quiet, take a break, and listen to what's going on in our internal world. So, it's not always that bad. We label everything, don't we? Is that this is good and this is bad.
Yeah, that's where I keep going back in my mind over and over again to what you taught me, which is instead of good and bad, it's like and don't like, prefer and don't prefer.
Yeah, or it's uncomfortable or comfortable.
Or there's another one.
It's like I had these emotions, and they felt uncomfortable to me.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Not that they're bad or wrong, because once we label something bad, and I was just talking about somebody this morning. So often, once we label something bad, we make it wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Which is even worse, right?
Yeah.
It's like moving because then we blame either someone else or we blame ourselves. And now we're in victim mode with that energy of blame, all because we decided something was bad. When if we would have just decided that it was uncomfortable, we may have gone down a different path with it. So, all right. Well, I don't want to get too far on a tangent here, but.
Well, actually, that's an appropriate tangent now that I think about it, because I saw somebody who posted in an LOA group, what's your feeling about the moral state of the world? So clearly this is on other people's minds as well, and it's an important thing to bring up, that we get hooked onto these questions of this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. And all we're doing is just setting ourselves up when we do that. So this is a good time to start learning a new way of talking to ourselves.
Exactly. I've been thinking about that a lot, about some words. There are 3 words that I'm working on right now. And I've written about this extensively, but these are new. I'm working on these 3 words in my own life, just me personally, changing them up. The words want and need, and the word anxious, right? So want and need, I've changed them, or I'm working on it. I still slip, right? I'm working on changing want and need to desire and require.
Okay.
And I'm working on changing anxious to eager.
Ooh.
So even though anxious can be used in sort of a benign way, like, oh, Walt, I was so anxious to come on the podcast today, I rather say I'm eager, right? Because
it's a much different vibration.
Saying that I have desires and requirements and I'm eager for things is a much different energy than saying I want, I need, right? And I'm anxious.
I mean, you can almost feel it just when you say the word. The word eager, you say eager, it's like, whoa, I feel eager.
So recognize that words have vibration, frequency, and meaning we've attached to them because of the allocation of meaning. And so if we can change up some of those more catabolic words in our language, we'll have a better energy about them. So that's what I've decided. I would rather be eagerly awaiting things that I have a desire for and requirements that I have than anxious because I want things and need things.
That's good. That's really good. I like that. I'm going to have to keep that in mind. Oh, by the way, Jeffrey says, I've spent a lot of time working with people, and getting sick caused me to avoid others, and I get my own personal work done now by avoiding others. So I guess there's another side to it too.
Well, we talk about this a lot, though, in coaching, is that there are often payoffs, right? There are payoffs.
Yeah.
That's the payoff.
That's right.
What was the payoff for getting sick? Well, I got a lot of downtime. I got alone time. I got to, I got to Netflix out. I got to get my personal work done, whatever it is. It's like, that was the payoff.
That's
it. So sometimes we have, consequences that are actually a payoff, and we're sort of willing to do it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So Neville says that, I like this next sentence, fable. Because now he's using the word fable, which is kind of like we've been changing up words, right? Instead of need, I require. Okay. Fable enacted as a sort of stage play in the mind is what causes the physical facts of life. I like mythology and fables and the idea that they have deep meaning for us. And so here Neville is saying this is how we actually cause physical things to become physical facts. It starts in a stage play in the mind. Man believes that reality resides in the solid objects he sees around him, that it is in this world that the drama of life originates, that events spring suddenly into existence, created moment by moment out of antecedent physical facts. But causation does not lie in the external world of facts. The drama of life originates in the imagination of man. The real act of becoming takes place within man's imagination and not without. The following stories could define causation as the assemblage of mental states which occurring creates that which the assemblage implies. The foreword from Walter Lord's A Night to Remember illustrates my claim. Imagining creates reality. And so then he quotes, in 1898, a struggling author named Morgan Robertson concocted a novel about a fabulous Atlantic liner, far larger than any that had ever been built. Robertson loaded his ship with rich and complacent people and then wrecked it one cold April night on an iceberg. This somehow showed the futility of everything. And in fact, the book was called Futility when it appeared that year, published by the firm of M.F. Mansfield. 14 years later, a British shipping company named the White Star Line built a steamer remarkably like the one in Robertson's novel. The new liner was 66,000 tons displacement. Robertson's was 70,000 tons. The real ship was 882.5 feet long. The fictional one was 800 feet. Both could carry about 3,000 people, and both had enough lifeboats for only a fraction of this number. But then this didn't seem to matter because both were labeled unshakable. On April 19th, 1912, the real ship left Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. Her cargo included a priceless copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and a list of passengers collectively worth $250 million. On her way over, she, too, struck an iceberg and went down on a cold April night. Robertson called his ship the Titan. The White Star Line called its ship the Titanic.
It's just frightening. The similarity is just frightening.
Right? And what it was, 14 years? 14 years later.
Yeah, and both were labeled unsinkable too, which is really just, right. I mean, yeah.
Had Morgan Robertson known that imagining creates reality, that today's fiction is tomorrow's fact, would he have written the novel Futility? In the moment of the tragic catastrophe, writes Schopenhauer, the conviction becomes more distinct to us than ever that life is a bad dream from which we have to awake. And the bad dream is caused by the imaginal activity of sleeping humanity. What's interesting about this is an experience that I had when I was in a group. It was a group coaching experience. And one of the members in the group was a writer. And it was not a writer's group. It was a group of people that did all kinds of things, but all creative people. And she was having a lot of trouble with things going on in her life that were pretty crazy, pretty scary. And, you know, kind of like dramatic, these stories of things that were actually happening. And at one point, the coach that was coaching the group said, "What do you write about in your books?" And she wrote horror. And it was like along the same lines of things that were actually happening in her life. And the coach said, well, if you immerse yourself in this kind of story, writing, 8-10 hours a day, how can it not start showing up? And I was like, oh my goodness, that is wild, right?
Absolutely.
But it's so true. It's so true. And so, yeah, this was really something.
It also reminds me of something that I've been kind of paying a little attention to the last few months. And it's as with anything else with the law of attraction, the more I pay attention to it, the more examples come to my attention.
Right.
But I have a new understanding of the word prophecy now. I used to think of prophecy as prediction. I make this prophecy, and in the future, this thing will happen that I predicted is going to happen. And I predicted it because I was able to tap into the future and recognize what was going to come. And so that's how it all came about. Now I understand prophecy to be law of attraction, where
it's generative.
What's that?
It's generative.
It's generative, right? It generates the event, which is really, I like it a lot better. I mean, I used to have trouble with the idea of prophecy. Now I actually like the idea of prophecy, because what prophecy really means to me is creating.
Yeah. Speaking the words and having them come to pass.
Right.
Yeah.
And that ties in directly to what Neville was talking about earlier. He talks about we realize our responsibility as a creator and imagine only the best imaginable. Well, he's also giving some good examples of how people didn't imagine the best imaginable, but it really reinforces, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that.
Well, and he uses the word responsibility.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that idea, to whom much is given, much is required.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if people realized how much power they had, then they would maybe be more responsible with that power.
Right. Yeah.
So he says, continuing on, imaginal activities may be remote from their manifestation, and unobserved events are only appearance. Causation is seen in this tragedy is elsewhere in space-time. Far off from the scene of action, invisible to all, was Robertson's imaginal activity. like a scientist in a control room directing his guided missile through space-time. And then he quotes Samuel Butler. It says, who paints a picture, writes a play or book, which others read while he's asleep in bed, or the other side of the world when they o'erlook. His page, the sleeper, might as well be dead. What knows he of his distant, unfelt life? What knows he of the thoughts his thoughts are raising, the life his life is giving, or the strife? Concerning him, some cavilling, some praising. Yet which is most alive, he who's asleep, or his quick spirit in some other place, or score of other places that doth keep attention fixed and sleep from others' chase? Which is the he that sleeps, or he that his own he can neither feel nor see? So I love the idea of him being a scientist in a control room.
Mm.
It's like he's writing this story, but who is it going to affect?
And that's the key question, and it's the key point, really, because who's it going to affect? Well, primarily himself. And the more that he focuses on X, whatever X is, the more it's going to affect him. So once again, be very selective about what it is you're going to focus your attention on, regardless of whether you call yourself a scientist.
Yeah, well, I think that when you're talking about a book, especially a work of fiction that then gets put into the hands of many people who are reading it,
Yeah.
right? I don't know how many people read that book, but so Neville says imaginative writers.
They all went down on the Titanic, probably.
Imaginative writers communicate not their vision of the world, but their attitudes which result in their vision. Just a short while before Catherine Mansfield died, she said to her friend, Orage, there are in life as many aspects as attitudes toward it, and aspects change with attitudes. Could we change our attitude, we should not only see life differently, but life itself would come to be different. Life would undergo a change of appearance because we ourselves had undergone a change in attitude. Perception of a new pattern is what I call a creative attitude towards life. Interesting that he quotes that she said this a short while before she died.
Why is that?
Well, because I wonder, I just think it's interesting that he mentioned that. And I find it interesting because I'm curious why.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I
have a feeling he's going to give us a clue, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Prophets, wrote Blake, here we go, Walt.
Mm-hmm.
In the modern sense of the word, have never existed. Jonah was no prophet in the modern sense, for his prophecy of Nineveh failed. Every honest man is a prophet. He utters his opinion both of private and public matters. Thus, if you go on and on, the result is so. He never says, such a thing shall happen, let you do what you will. A prophet is a seer, not an arbitrary dictator. The function of the prophet is not to tell us what is inevitable, but to tell us what can be built up out of persistent imaginal activities.
Yeah, there it is.
The future is determined by the imaginal activities of humanity, activities in their creative march, activities which can be seen, quote, in your dreams and the visions of your head as you lay in bed. Quote, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, Numbers 11:29. In the true sense of the word, like this dancer who now, from the summit of his realized ideal, sights yet higher peaks that are to be scaled. After you've read the story, you will understand why he is so confident that he can predetermine any materialistic future he desires, and why he is equally sure that others give reality to what were otherwise a mere figment of his imagination, that there exists and can exist nothing outside imagining on some other level. Nothing continues in being save what imagining supports. Then he quotes Lord Byron, the mind can make substance is capitalized in this quote, the mind can make substance and people planets of its own with beings brighter than have been, and give a breath to forms which can outlive all flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is one of my favorite Neville stories coming up.
Ah, yes.
As my story begins, at the age of 19, I was a mildly successful dancing teacher and continued in this static state for almost 5 years. At the end of this time, I met a young lady who talked me into attending your lectures. My thought upon hearing you say imagining creates reality was that the entire idea was ridiculous. However, I decided to accept your challenge and disprove your thesis. I bought your book, Out of This World, and read it many times. As a side note, Walt and I have covered Out of This World, so there's a whole podcast series on that book.
Absolutely, yes.
So I bought your book, Out of This World, and read it many times. Still unconvinced, I set myself a rather ambitious goal. My present position was as an instructor with the Arthur Murray Dance Studio, and my goal was to own a franchise and be boss of an Arthur Murray Dance Studio myself. This seemed the most unlikely thing in the world, as franchises were extremely difficult to secure. But on top of this fact, I was completely without the necessary funds to begin such an operation. Nevertheless, I assumed the feeling of my wish fulfilled as night after night, in my imagination, I went to sleep managing my own studio.
I want to interrupt for a second, too, and point out how he started out here. He says, I decided to accept your challenge and disprove your thesis. So look at all the steps he went through. He was being very thorough in following all the instructions so he could disprove it, so he could prove that it doesn't work.
He was putting a lot of energy into making sure. And that's interesting as well, is that so many times when we're going into this kind of work, we're really careful that our intention is pure around our desire.
Right.
And in this case, this guy was pretty much recognizing that he was going to fail. I mean, he didn't have faith in the process. He was going to disprove it. So that's really interesting in itself.
In fact, it disproves the thesis that you have to have the faith of a mustard seed. You actually don't have to have any faith at all. All you have to do is just keep going at it.
And also make a note that take note of the fact that he said he did this night after night in his imagination as he went to sleep, which is something that Neville often talks about. So he says, I assumed the feeling of my wish fulfilled as night after night in my imagination, I went to sleep managing my own studio. 3 weeks later, a friend called me from Reno, Nevada. He had the Murray studio there and said it was too much for him to cope with alone. He offered me a partnership, and I was delighted, so delighted, in fact, that I hastened to Reno on borrowed money and promptly forgot all about you and your story of imagination. My partner and I worked hard and were very successful, but after a year, I was still not satisfied. I wanted more. I began thinking of ways and means to get another studio. All my efforts failed. One night, as I retired, I was restless and decided to read. As I looked through my collection of books, I noticed your slender volume, Out of This World. I thought of the silly nonsense I had gone through 1 year ago before getting my own studio. Getting my own studio. The words in my mind electrified me. I reread that book that night, and later in my imagination, I heard my superior praise the good job we had done in Reno and suggest we acquire a second studio, as he had a second location ready for us if we desired to expand. I reenacted this imaginal scene nightly without fail. 3 weeks from the first night of my imaginal drama, it materialized, almost word for word. My partner accepted the new studio in Bakersfield, and I had the Reno studio alone. Now I was convinced of the truth of your teaching, and never again will I forget. Now, I think one of the things that always stands out to me about this particular story is that both times he says 3 weeks later.
Yes.
He says it twice so far.
He does.
3 weeks later. And I was like, so many times you read a story like this and you have no idea. When they say night after night, it's like, was it 5 years? Was it 2 days? What was it?
Yep.
This guy's got it down to some kind of science within himself, because 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later.
Well, it also suggests to me that whatever resistances he had within himself, and we all have them, various kinds of resistances based on preconceptions that we have and experiences that we've had and so on and so forth. Those resistances took, on average, 3 weeks to get past.
Right.
That's what that was about.
Yeah. So he says, now I wanted to share this wonderful knowledge of imaginal power with my staff. I tried to tell them of the marvels they could accomplish, but I was unable to reach many, although one fantastic incident resulted from my efforts to tell this story. A young teacher told me he believed my story, but said it would have probably happened anyway in time. He insisted the entire theory was nonsense, but stated that if I could tell him something of an incredible nature that would actually happen and which he could witness, then he would believe. I accepted his challenge and conceived a truly fantastic test. The Reno studio is the most insignificant in the entire Murray system because of the small population count in the city itself. There are over 300 Murray studios in the country with much larger populations, therefore providing greater possibilities to draw from. So my test was this. I told the teacher that within the next 3 months, at the time of a national dance convention, the Little Reno studio would be the foremost topic of conversation at that convention. He calmly stated that was quite impossible. That night when I retired, I felt myself standing before a tremendous audience. I was speaking on creative imagining and felt the nervousness of being before such a vast audience. But I also felt the wonderful sensation of audience acceptance. I heard the roar of applause as I left the stage. I saw Mr. Murray himself come forward and shake my hand. I reenacted this entire drama night after night. It began to take on the tones of reality, and I knew I had done it again. My imaginal drama materialized down to the last detail. My Little Reno studio was the talk of the convention, and I did appear on that stage just as I had done in my imagination. But even after this unbelievable actual happening, the young teacher who threw me the challenge remained unconvinced. He said it had all happened too naturally, and he was sure it would have happened anyway. I did not mind his attitude because his challenge had given me another opportunity to prove, at least to myself, that imagining does create reality. From that time on, I continued with my ambition to own the largest Arthur Murray dance studio in the world. Night after night, in my imagination, I heard myself accepting a studio franchise for a great city. Within 3 weeks, here we go again, within 3 weeks, Mr. Murray called me and offered a studio in a city of 1.5 million people. It is now my goal to make my studio the greatest and biggest in the entire system. And of course, I know it will be done through my imagination.
I love it. I love it. I love also how this story really beautifully illustrates the problem of prophecy that we were discussing. Because on the one hand, we have the storyteller himself, who at first was a doubter, then had the experience a few times and really, really believed and was trying to educate his teachers who worked for him how the thing worked. And one of them had adopted the viewpoint that it would have happened anyway. In other words, he had adopted what I would call my original view of prophecy. Prophecy is just, saying this is what's going to happen. And right. It's just great. It would have happened anyway, regardless of whether I gave a prophecy about it.
Regardless of whether somebody was able to tap into the future and see it and speak about it or not, it was going to happen.
It was going to happen. It was inevitable. It was fate. It was fated, and it was inevitable. And so that's an interesting thing by itself. Now, Jeffrey added to this, and I want to bring in what Jeffrey said. He said, do others have to read your work or hear your words in order for the prophecy to come true? That's an interesting point.
Well, I would say no, but that the reason, if you're going to call it prophecy, I believe it's because it's been spoken and been witnessed.
Right. Yeah, that's part of the root of the word.
Down or, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what makes it prophecy, but you can decree something and speak it and call something into being without anyone hearing you. I don't think it has to be heard or written down to manifest. But in order for it to be called prophecy, I think that's the whole point of it being called prophecy, is that it was spoken and witnessed.
Which makes me wonder, what would his friend have said if he had written it down and secretly hidden it away?
Well, but here's the thing: is his friend said, "Okay, I will believe it if you can tell me something that's ridiculously impossible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I hear you say it, and then I watch it happen myself.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'll believe it." And when he told him, this is what I'm going to do, our little studio here is going to be the talk of the big convention, the teacher said, that's impossible. Well, that was what he was asking for.
It
He
is.
said, give me something impossible. And then he watched it unfold and still said it would have happened anyway. So that's going to always be probably the answer from that person or that type of person, right? Is, oh, it would have happened anyway. He's a non-believer. So
well, that's the question that I'm raising, though. The question I'm raising is, what if the order had been reversed? And I'm thinking about it in terms of like how a magician would do his magic trick. You know, a magician actually manipulates physical reality, but he does it in a way that it looks like he's doing something else. He creates the illusion of something.
Yes,
a stage magician.
Right.
A stage magician, it's all sleight of hand. It's mirrors. It's
right.
deceiving the eye and making you look one way so that he can do something the other way.
Right.
And that's what that whole art is all about. And it's fun. It's a very educational thing. But we love that because we were deceived, and we know we were deceived, and we were deliberately deceived, and it's fun.
Yeah.
If it was a situation where the deception was happening because of some sort of a ulterior motive, now we don't like that so much. But when we're doing it just for educational and entertainment purposes, we like that. So I'm wondering what that same person who said, yes, he wanted to have it in the exact way you described it, and he got it, and it still didn't work for him. I'm wondering what his response would have been if our storyteller had simply written the prophecy down, hidden it away, and then let the events unfold, and then shown him the prophecy after the fact.
Right.
In other words, the sleight of hand of, well, here was the prophecy that was written. I wonder how he would have taken it at that point, because it would be more entertaining that way.
It would. If he had said, I'm going to write something down, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and mail it to you, but I do not want you to open it.
Right.
Until I tell you you can open it.
Yeah.
And he tells him to open it after the fact.
Yeah.
You have a good point there, is that because of the kind of shock value.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
We like being entertained as human beings. We really do like it. And I'm convinced it influences so much of our thought patterns, of our choices in life, about the things that we do in life, the paths that we walk on. I mean, fictional stories as told by stage magicians and comics and theatrical productions and movies and authors of novels and so forth influence us tremendously, in large part because of the entertainment value.
Yeah, and it's funny. We read the quote from him talking about fables, using the word fables.
That's right. Yeah.
And fables and mythology, fairy tales, if you will, all of those stories, they all have anchors in reality to our own experiences. That's the hero's journey.
That's right.
And we all live that all the time. And so I think that's another reason why we find them to be interesting, is not only are they entertaining, but that they touch us in a place that feels real to us.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like our own experience is mirrored in those stories.
It is. That's true.
All right. So I think following on, he says, imagining, he's quoting Douglas Fawcett, may be hard to grasp, being quicksilver-like. It vanishes into each of its metamorphoses and thereby displays its transformative magic. We must look beyond the physical fact for the imagining which has caused it. For 1 year, EOL, that's the dance instructor, for 1 year, EOL Jr. lost himself in his metamorphosis, but fortunately he remembered the silly nonsense he had gone through before getting his own studio and reread the book. I thought that was so funny. But he's done this for 3 weeks. Every night. And then he gets a phone call about an opportunity to have a studio. And he said, yes, he took it right away. He said, yes, right away, put the book back on the shelf and never thought about the book again.
Which we do a lot more than we realize.
Yeah, I guess you're right about that. Yeah.
I think we do. And once again, he's also introducing the value of entertainment, because the entertainment part was discovering that the book said, do this, and he had done it, and oh my God, I actually did that, and it produced the result.
That's my favorite part of the story, when he says, well, before I got my own studio.
Yeah, right. What am I saying?
Right. Neville says, imaginal acts on the human level need a certain interval of time to develop. But imaginal acts, whether committed to print or locked in the bosom of a hermit, will realize themselves in time. So two different things here. He's talking about, because he actually says he doesn't talk about speaking it, but he talks about committing it to print, keeping it locked in the bosom of a hermit. Okay, keeping it to yourself or writing it down. He says it needs some time, but they will realize themselves in time. Test yourself, if only out of curiosity. You will discover the prophet, in quotes, the prophet is your own imagining, and you will know there is no fiction. Now, this reminds me of stories that we hear, especially as a relationship coach, stories that we hear of people writing down a list of what they're looking for in a soulmate. And I think I've told this story before. When my marriage was ending in 2006, I went to see a therapist because things were really bad. And I just decided I'm going to go have a meeting with this therapist to kind of give me some support here. And the therapist said to me, and my marriage had not ended yet, right? Like I still had hope that my marriage might be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And the therapist said to me, I want you to do some homework for me. I want you to go home and write down a list of everything you would have in a spouse if your spouse was just shoot for the moon, like everything you would want in a partner. Which was really odd to me because I wasn't looking for another partner.
Right.
Right? I was married. And so I said, why do you want me to do this? She said, it's just part of the homework. Don't put too much thought in it. Just go write that list. Well, I went home and I got a notebook and I wrote this list and I stuck it away in a drawer. One thing happened with me writing the list. I realized how far away I was from that ideal.
Ah, yes.
And then 6 years later, I had been divorced for 5 of those 6 years. 6 years later, I met someone who I'm now married to in 2011. And about 3 months after I met him, I was cleaning out a cupboard and I found that notebook. I had forgotten all about it. And right. I opened it up and it was like a description of him. So that was homework that was not instructed for me to turn it in. It was just go home and do this.
Mm-hmm.
So no one ever saw what I had written in that book.
Yeah.
Right. But it was written in a book and tucked away in my bosom. Right. It was put away. I didn't share it with anybody. And then 6 years later, boom, there it was. And I was blown away when I found it. I read the list. I didn't even remember some of the things I put on the list. I was like, oh my goodness. Right. So would you call that prophecy?
Absolutely. I would actually take his phrase and say, you discovered that the prophet is your own imagining.
Yeah. Right. Because where else did all of that come from?
That's right. He proved it very clearly by saying nobody else saw it. Nobody else could have seen it. It was not possible for anybody else to see it.
So Neville goes on to quote a bunch of different quotes here, and we'll read through them. William Butler Yeats, he says, we should never be certain that it was not some woman treading in the winepress who began that subtle change in men's mind, or that the passion, because of which so many countries were given to the sword, did not begin in the mind of some shepherd boy, lighting up his eyes for a moment before it ran upon its way. There is no fiction. Imagining fulfills itself in what our lives become. And now I have told you before it takes place, so that when it does take place, you may believe. He quotes from the Christian Bible, John 14:29. The Greeks were right. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men, Acts 14:11. But they've fallen asleep and do not realize the might they wield by their imaginal activities. And then he quotes John Keats. Real are the dreams of gods and smoothly pass, their pleasure in a long immortal dream. E.B., an author, is fully aware that today's fiction can become tomorrow's fact. In this letter, she writes, one spring, I completed a novelette, sold it and forgot it. Not until many long months later did I sit down and nervously compare some facts in my fiction with some facts in my life. Please read a brief outline of my created story and then compare it with my personal experience. The heroine of my story took a vacation trip to Vermont, to the small city of Stowe, Vermont, to be exact. When she reached her destination, she was faced with such unpleasant behavior on the part of her companion that she either had to continue her lifetime pattern of allowing another's selfish demand dominate her, or to break that pattern and leave. She broke it and returned to New York. When she returned, and the story continues, events took shape in a proposal of marriage, which she happily accepted. For my part of this tale, as small events evolved, I began to remember the dictates of my own pen and insignificant relationship. This is what happened to me. I received an invitation from a friend offering a vacation at her summer place in Vermont. I accepted and was not startled at first when I learned her summer place was in the city of Stowe.
Of course it was.
When I arrived, I found my hostess in such a highly nervous state that I realized I was faced with either wretched summer or the choice of walking out on her. Never before in my life had I been strong enough to ignore what I thought were the claims of duty and friendship. But this time I did, and without ceremony, I returned to New York. A few days after I returned to my home, I too received a proposal of marriage. But at this point, fact and fiction parted. I refused the offer. I know, Neville, now that there is no such thing as fiction.
It's an interesting point that he's making too. There's no such thing as fiction. And I can hear in my mind people who are Neville followers turning that into a mantra. There's no such thing as fiction. There's no such thing as fiction. But I also want to point out there's value in having the word fiction around, because fiction is how we allow ourselves to engage in fictional imaginings.
Sure.
Because we can't deal with, well, this is what the real is. Reality is something completely different. And we talked about this at the beginning. I can't change that reality by lying about it. I can't tell a lie about what that reality is. So fiction gives us the way out. Fiction is our way of saying, well, I'm not really telling a lie. I'm just telling a little story.
So it can serve us, right?
That's right. It serves us very well.
In chaos magic, there's an idea of writing a hypersigil, which is basically this. It's writing a story that you want to see come to pass, and having it come to pass.
Absolutely.
There are whole scores of people who have done it, me included, and it's very powerful. So I think we can finish the chapter.
Yeah, go for it. Let's get it done.
All right. So Neville quotes George Meredith, Ballads and Poems of Tragic Life. Forgetful is green earth, the gods alone remember everlastingly. By their great memories, the gods are known. He comments, ends run true to their imaginal origins. We reap the fruit of forgotten blossom time. In life, the events do not come up always where we have strewn the seeds, so that we may not recognize our own harvest. Events are the emergence of a hidden imaginal activity. Man is free to imagine whatever he desires. This is why, despite all fatalists and misguided prophets of doom, all awakened men know that they are free. They know that they are creating reality. Is there a scriptural passage to support this claim? Yes. He quotes Genesis 41:13, and it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. W.B. Yeats must have discovered that there is no fiction, for after describing some of his experiences in the conscious use of imagination, he writes, if all who have described events like this have not dreamed, we should rewrite our histories, for all men, certainly all imaginative men, must be forever casting forth enchantments, glamours, illusions. And all men, especially tranquil men, who have no powerful egotistic life, must be continually passing under their power. Our most elaborate thoughts, elaborate purposes, precise emotions are often, as I think, not really ours, but have on a sudden come up, as it were, out of hell or down out of heaven, from ideas of good and evil. Neville closes the chapter by saying, there is no fiction. Imagine better than the best you know.
That's a good way to finish too and conclude. I know something else that is not fiction, and that is that Cindy Chavez is one wonderful life coach. So in our last 30 seconds, please tell people how to reach Cindy Chavez, the life coach.
They can reach me at my website, cindychavez.com, CINDIECHAVEZ.com. I would love to hear from you. Give me a shout.
Oh yeah, and it's so much fun to hear from people. So please feel free. Don't, even if you're not actually going to engage or contact her anyway, because we just love hearing from
Say
listeners.
hello.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to going on to chapter 5 of Neville. We actually got a chapter done in one episode. Can you believe that? Oh my goodness.
Exciting.
Good stuff. So thank you. Thank you to our live stream listeners. Thank you especially to our podcast listeners as well. And we will see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.